key question in evolutionary research is, how does the world become filled with species? Are there limits to how many species Earth can hold? And what, if anything, sets those limits? This set of questions concerns the processes underlying radiations of organisms, in which species expand into a wide variety of habitats and ecological niches and increase their biodiversity, sometimes a lot. Darwin, in The Origin of Species, suggested that ecosystem evolution can be likened to a log stuffed with splitting wedges. In his analogy, the log is an ecosystem, and each splitting wedge represents an organism occupying a specific habitat in that ecosystem. Initially, new species find an unoccupied ecosystem. Each taxon can be established anywhere. In the log analogy, you can put the splitting wedge almost anywhere, since there are already few there. Later, new species find it harder to do novel things in the environment because there are so many competitors already present. In Darwin's analogy, the log is getting filled with wedges. As the environment fills with species, new ones can only become established by one of four methods. First, they can wait for one of these wedges to fall out, that is, a species to become extinct. Alternatively, they could knock out rival wedges through competition and establish new species that way. Third, they could become a smaller wedge that fits in between the big boys. This strategy is that of becoming an ecological specialist that uses the existing species as habitat, such as a bee that pollinates a plant. Finally, a fourth approach is to go and find another log. Here the idea is to enter a new unoccupied ecosystem. Quoting that sage of sci-fi, Captain Kirk, "Space, the final frontier." Another feature of radiations is they often produce logistic growth of species biodiversity. The total diversity of organisms is a function of the balance between origination, also called speciation, and extinction. In unconstrained diversity-independent growth, origination rates rise exponentially. In Darwin's analogy, the log is nearly empty, so it is not hard to place new wedges in it, since there's lots of space. Eventually, the environment becomes packed with incumbents who restrict the addition of new species. This is a similar situation to the notion that the log starts to fill with splitting wedges. Now we get density-dependent growth, in which the rate of species addition is constrained by total diversity. Density dependence causes origination rates to drop off in logistic growth. Diversity rises as long as speciation exceeds extinction and reaches its maximum when they balance. After this, the only way to add more species is if some of the incumbents become extinct. John Alroy in 1998 tested Cenozoic mammals for diversity dependence and found good evidence for this. Equilibrium diversities reached about 20 million years after the KPG extinction cleaned out all the remaining wedges known as dinosaurs. A lot of radiations are like this, taking 15 to 20 million years for the ecosystem to fill up. More broadly, Sapkowski 1978 argued that Phanerozoic diversity consists of an initial phase of density-independent growth, followed by a series of logistic growth curves in which biodiversity seems to hit Earth's carrying capacity and no more species can be added. Subsequently, mass extinction resets total biodiversity back to varying levels of density independence, and new radiations can begin. One of the very striking features of the Paleozoic record is that it continues to return to about the same taxonomic diversity after each extinction. This pattern suggests that the Paleozoic became saturated, such that there are few new ways to make a living being discovered, even when the ecosystem was being repeatedly cleaned out by one mass extinction after another. Indeed, Sapkowski's 1978 and 1983 compilations were based upon orders and families of marine invertebrates, which show a rapid rise in the Cambrian Ordovician, followed pretty much by a plateau to the present day. The implication is that virtually all high-level taxa evolved very early. It appears that the number of really basic body plans saturated somewhere in the late Silurian and never increased farther. Apparently life is a zero-sum game on the level of body plans. Now this pattern seems really odd. After all, we know that forests and terrestrial ecosystems were established in the Paleozoic. Did they really have no effect on overall marine biodiversity? Instead, the big rise in biodiversity in Sapkowski's records is associated with the Mesozoic and Cenozoic, when the diversity limits seem to be burst. Indeed, there are still some groups like insects, angiosperms, and bony fish that show additive trends that suggest they are far from reaching saturation, particularly in the Mesozoic. Insects, for instance, continue to find ways to specialize even further on plants, animals, soils, and even the ocean. There are still plenty of ways to add new species in these groups. This is amazing. Apparently, the Earth can still hold a lot more species. Now, at this juncture, it's worthwhile to guard against overinterpretation of the record. Just how much should we trust the genus and family level data? Do we have to clear out the incumbents with the Permo-Triassic mass extinction to get the Mesozoic radiation? And what triggers the radiations in the first place? Is it change in metabolism with rise of endothermy, or an increase in mutualisms with plant-insect symbioses? Before we get to these questions, we first have to decide if the basic data on animal diversity are actually any good, as we shall do next.